She had given orders on battlefields. She had stood in war zones where silence could mean death. But on this night in Atlanta, none of that mattered. The flashing lights caught her as she crossed the street, the kind of ordinary moment that should have ended with a warning or nothing at all. Instead, within seconds, 2 officers closed in, their voices sharp, their hands already reaching for her arm. She wasn't in uniform, she wasn't surrounded by soldiers. She was just another woman walking to her car, carrying a silver case that no one on that street seemed to notice, except them. "Ma'am, watch your tone," one of them said. The second officer stepped closer. Aaliyah Monroe, a 4-star general of the United States Army, barely had time to respond before cold steel locked around her wrists. And in that moment, rank meant nothing. Her record, her years of service, her medals, they vanished under the weight of those handcuffs. What the crowd saw was a black woman arrested for talking back. What they didn't see was the case taken from her hands. What they didn't hear was the voice on the police radio, confirming she was their target. That footage, captured on 3 different phones, never made it to the evening news, because less than an hour later, her name was wiped from the report. Her arrest disappeared from the system. But why? Why would the Pentagon call a precinct in the middle of the night to erase a traffic stop? And what was in that case that no one has ever found again? Stay with me. This story only grows heavier from here. And before we go further, I need you to do one thing. If you believe stories like this should never be buried, hit subscribe right now. And in the comments tell me, if this happened in your city, would you stay silent or would you speak out? Because the truth is, silence has already cost too much. Hours before the arrest, General Aaliyah Monroe had walked into a windowless room inside the Pentagon. The air was still, the walls bare, no insignia, no flags, just a steel table and a case resting on top. It wasn't her first classified briefing, but something about this one unsettled her. The officer who slid the case toward her never made eye contact. He only whispered one instruction: "Keep it sealed until you're alone." She asked what was inside. He didn't answer. He simply left the room. That case followed her onto the flight back to Atlanta. It followed her into the restaurant where she met a longtime friend for dinner. It followed her out onto the quiet street where the patrol car waited. Nobody else seemed to notice it. Not the waiter, not the patrons, not the pedestrians passing by. But the men watching from across the street noticed. They noticed every step she took with it in her hand. That's why the officers didn't ask about her ID. That's why they didn't ask about her destination. Their eyes never left the case. And here's the part no one has ever explained. When Aaliyah was shoved into the back of the cruiser, the case was gone. Not dropped, not misplaced. Gone. And within the hour, so was every trace of her arrest. Why would a decorated general be treated like a common suspect? Why erase her from the system entirely? And more importantly, what was inside that silver case that someone didn't want her to carry home? I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below. Was this just about authority clashing with her voice, or was something far larger moving behind those flashing lights? And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because this story only grows more dangerous, and you need to hear what happens next. The holding cell was no battlefield, but the silence inside it cut just as deep. General Aaliyah Monroe sat on the metal bench, her wrists still raw from the cuffs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a steady hum, almost mocking. One officer leaned against the bars, smirking. "You think your stars mean anything here?" He didn't know her name. Or maybe he did, and that made it worse. For years, she had commanded soldiers, negotiated with allies, faced threats on foreign soil. But in that moment, none of it mattered. To them, she was just another woman to put in her place, just another voice they wanted quiet. And when she spoke, calmly, firmly, with the same precision she used when issuing orders, one of them slammed his fist against the bars. "Watch your tone." The same phrase again, repeated like a ritual, The humiliation wasn't just the cuffs, it was the laughter in the room. It was the way her rank was dismissed, stripped down to nothing. It was the quiet whisper from an older sergeant as he passed her cell. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't stop this." For a brief second, it sounded like mercy. But later, she would realize he wasn't apologizing for her. He was apologizing for himself, because the moment he walked away, he deleted his own body cam footage. Think about that. A decorated general in custody, and the first act of the police that night wasn't justice, it was erasure. And here's where the story bends into silence. No official record of her booking exists. No footage survived. Every trace of her name vanished from the system within the hour. But why? Why erase her so completely, as though she'd never been there at all? And why did that apology sound less like guilt and more like fear? If you're watching this right now, I want your take. Was this humiliation a mistake? Or was it the first step in a plan that started long before those cuffs clicked shut? The clock above the desk read 3:17 a.m. The precinct was quiet except for the low murmur of officers shuffling papers and typing half-hearted reports. General Aaliyah Monroe sat alone, still cuffed, her dignity stripped bare. Then the phone rang. The desk sergeant frowned. Calls at that hour were usually drunks, accidents, or routine transfers. But this was no routine call. He straightened as he listened, his face draining of color. "Understood," he said. "Yes, sir." And then, almost whispering, "We'll take care of it." Every officer within earshot froze. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smirked. The room shifted. Something unseen had just taken command. Within minutes, the arresting officers were pulled from the room. Their body cams were malfunctioning. Their reports were shredded before the ink had even dried. A black SUV rolled quietly into the back lot, its windows tinted darker than regulation allowed. Two men in suits stepped inside, said nothing, and unlocked her cell. "General Monroe, you're coming with us." She stood, straightening her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "Am I free to go?" she asked. No answer. Just a firm grip on her arm as she was escorted out. Not released, not charged, but removed. The sergeant who had whispered his apology earlier wouldn't even look at her now, because he knew what she didn't. That phone call hadn't been made to protect her. It had been made to protect someone else. And erasing her arrest was only the beginning. Here's where the silence grows louder. Why would the Pentagon reach into a local police station in the dead of night? Why erase her arrest, erase the footage, erase every trace she'd ever been there? And most importantly, why did those men in the SUV never return her case? The footage you'll never see leaves us with one unshakable truth. General Monroe wasn't freed that night. She was contained. The question is, for what purpose? The SUV glided through the empty streets of Washington, D.C. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the soft hum of tires on asphalt. General Aaliyah Monroe sat between two men who refused to speak, their eyes fixed forward like statues carved from stone. She stared at the city lights flickering past the tinted windows, her wrists now free of the cuffs but her freedom gone all the same. In her mind, one question pulsed louder than the sound of the engine. Do I fight or do I wait? Because Aaliyah knew the game. Silence was survival. Silence kept you alive long enough to see tomorrow, but silence also meant surrendering to power, to injustice, to the erasure of everything she had fought for. Her thoughts wandered back to the cell, to the smirk on the officer's face, to the laughter that tried to strip her dignity away. She could swallow it, bury the rage, and live to see another day. Or she could speak. She could demand answers, demand justice, demand her case returned. And yet, every soldier knows the weight of timing. Speak too soon, and you tip your hand. Stay quiet too long, and you lose the chance forever. The SUV slowed. They weren't heading to the Pentagon. They weren't even on the route toward a military installation. The headlights cut across the Potomac, winding toward an unmarked compound few civilians had ever seen. One of the men finally spoke, his voice steady but cold. "You'll be briefed inside. Until then, don't talk." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. For the first time that night, Aliyah felt something deeper than humiliation. Not anger, not shame, but a flicker of doubt. What if the people pulling her strings now weren't allies? What if speaking up in that cell had been the least dangerous thing she'd done all evening? And here's where the moral line cuts sharp. Should she resist now, take the risk, raise her voice again, and face whatever storm that choice would bring? Or should she bide her time, play the part, and hope she lived long enough to tell her side of the story? The SUV passed through a gate that wasn't marked on any map. No insignia, no guardhouse with flashing lights, just a stretch of black steel that opened as if it already knew they were coming. General Aliyah Monroe stepped out into silence. No bustling soldiers, no chatter on radios, only the crunch of gravel beneath her boots and the low hum of floodlights washing the compound in sterile white. It didn't look like a military base. It looked like something built to be invisible. Windowless buildings, each identical, stretched in perfect rows across the lot. A place designed for one purpose: to exist without being seen. The two men guided her inside. The corridors were narrow, lined with concrete, lit by buzzing bulbs that flickered overhead. Every few feet, she caught sight of cameras, blinking red lights, watching her, recording her, cataloging her. Finally, she was led into a small room. A table, a single chair, a folder already waiting. The man closest to her gestured toward it. "Sit." She didn't move. Instead, she looked him in the eye, steady, unflinching. "I'm a decorated officer of the United States Army. You owe me an explanation." The man smirked, not unlike the officer in the precinct. But this time the power behind the smirk was heavier, more dangerous. "You were arrested tonight," he said. "And yet, you were never arrested. Do you understand?" Her pulse quickened, though her expression remained calm, erased, just like the missing footage, just like the missing case. He slid the folder across the table. Inside, she caught a glimpse of grainy photographs, her face, her family, her movements tracked from city to city, and in the corner of one page, a word she hadn't expected to see. Classified. But before she could read further, he closed the folder with a sharp slap. "You'll get answers," he said, "but not all at once." And then, something that froze her blood. On the table, just beyond the folder, was her case. The same case that had vanished from the cruiser. Unopened. Untouched. Or so it appeared. Her hand twitched slightly, the instinct to reach for it almost overwhelming. But the man leaned forward. "You'll open it when we tell you. Not before." The silence in that room was heavier than the cuffs had ever been, because now the stakes weren't just her dignity, her freedom, her rank. They were whatever lay sealed inside that case, and the shadowy hands that had already decided her fate. And here's the part that still leaves questions unanswered. What kind of power has the authority to erase an arrest, reroute a general, and control evidence without leaving a single trace? Across town, while General Monroe sat in that windowless room, a man named Ethan Cole was chasing a lead. Ethan wasn't a rookie. For 15 years he'd covered political scandals, corruption cases, stories most newsrooms buried under safer headlines. But tonight, the tip had come from a voice he didn't recognize. No name, no caller ID, just one sentence before the line went dead. "They've taken her. Look for the missing arrest." At first, Ethan thought it was a prank. But when he called 3 separate precincts across D.C., each one denied booking General Aliyah Monroe, which was strange because an eyewitness had already posted a shaky cell phone video of her being shoved into the back of a cruiser outside a restaurant in Georgetown. The clip spread quickly, then vanished, deleted from platforms, flagged as misinformation. But not before Ethan saved a copy. He slowed the footage frame by frame, and there it was, her face, unmistakable, her case, tucked under her arm, and the license plate of the patrol car, the same patrol car the police now claimed didn't exist. For journalists, moments like this were gold, but for Ethan, they were also dangerous. Because when the story you're chasing gets erased before you can publish it, someone powerful doesn't want it told. He printed the still frame and pinned it to his board. Beside it, he wrote 3 words in red marker. Who called me? Because here's where the first twist breaks through the silence. That anonymous call? It hadn't come from an ally. It hadn't come from a fellow whistleblower. Phone records would later show the source. The call that set Ethan on the trail of General Monroe had come from inside the Pentagon itself. And if that doesn't unsettle you, think about this. Why would the same institution that erased her arrest want a journalist digging it back up? Here's where the tension spikes. Someone inside the system wanted the story buried, but someone else, just as powerful, wanted it exposed. Ethan didn't know it yet, but by following that lead, he wasn't just uncovering a cover-up. He was stepping into a war being fought in the shadows, one that General Monroe had just been dragged into. And you have to ask yourself, if the Pentagon is fighting itself, whose side would you trust? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. For 2 days, General Aaliyah Monroe was kept inside the compound. No charges, no answers, just questions that no one would ask out loud. Every meal was delivered without a word. Every hallway was guarded by men who looked more like contractors than soldiers. Every attempt she made to speak was met with the same response. You'll be briefed soon. But soon never came. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Cole followed the trail of erased records. Every door he knocked on closed quickly. Every officer he pressed for answers turned suddenly forgetful. It was as if the entire city had agreed to keep one secret, that General Monroe's arrest had never happened. But then came the envelope. Slipped under Ethan's apartment door in the middle of the night. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, coordinates, and one line. She doesn't know who to trust. Ethan stared at it for hours before deciding to go. Because if the tip was real, it meant the general wasn't lost. She was being hidden. That night, under the shadow of the Potomac, Ethan pulled into the edge of an abandoned lot. The air was heavy, still, the kind of silence that makes you question every step. And then, movement. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, composed, a woman whose presence carried weight even without her uniform. General Monroe. Her voice was low, urgent. You shouldn't have come. Ethan raised the envelope. Then why was I told to? For a long moment she said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the shadows, scanning for watchers, for microphones, for the hidden eyes she'd come to expect. Finally she whispered, because someone wants this story told, but not by me. And just as she opened the case that had vanished, that had been returned, that no one was supposed to touch. Headlights cut across the lot, engines roared, doors slammed. They weren't alone. The meeting that was never supposed to happen had been found. Did someone betray her location? Or had the Pentagon led Ethan there deliberately, setting a trap for both of them? Engines roared. Headlights cut across the cracked pavement. General Monroe and Ethan Cole had only seconds before the lot was flooded with black SUVs. Ethan whispered sharply, "Run!" But Aaliyah didn't move. She stood tall, clutching the case in one hand, her eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. To flee would be survival. To stand her ground would be defiance. For a split second, she considered staying, but then the first door swung open, and men in tactical gear poured out. This wasn't police. This wasn't military. This was something in between, trained, armed, but stripped of any insignia. Ethan grabbed her arm. This isn't a negotiation. Finally, she ran. They cut through the lot, across the broken fence, and into the skeletal remains of an abandoned warehouse. Their footsteps echoed against rusted steel beams. Flashlights swept the walls, growing closer with every second. Inside, Monroe's voice was steady but low. "They know where we are. They were told." Ethan nodded grimly. "Then the question is, by who?" They pressed deeper into the building, weaving through shadows, ducking behind collapsed machinery. Every breath was measured, every sound dangerous. And just when they thought they'd found a way out, a spotlight cut through the cracks above. A voice boomed from outside. "General Monroe, you're not under arrest. You're under orders." She froze. Orders. It wasn't a demand for surrender. It was a reminder. A leash being yanked tight. Because somewhere in the chain of command, someone had decided her voice was no longer her own. Ethan whispered fiercely, "Don't listen to them." But here's the cliffhanger. Did she trust the journalist who'd risked everything to find her? Or the system that had already erased her once? Because one wrong step meant losing more than her freedom. It meant losing the truth forever. And the truth inside that case? That was the very reason she was being hunted. Before I reveal what happens when they finally open it, tell me in the comments, would you have run with Ethan or turned yourself in when they called it an order? The warehouse air was thick with dust. Every sound, every creak of steel, every echo of footsteps felt like a warning. General Monroe gripped the case tightly. For days it had been the silent weight chained to her side. Carried, stolen, returned, hidden, and now hunted. Ethan's eyes locked on it. "What's inside?" he demanded. "You've risked everything to keep it. If you want me to help you, I need to know." She hesitated, because even she didn't fully know. The case had been handed to her under orders she was told not to question. But now the same people who gave it to her were tearing the city apart to get it back. Finally, she whispered, "If we open it, there's no going back." A crash echoed through the warehouse. The pursuers were closing in. Time was gone. With a sharp twist, Monroe spun the combination lock. Click, click, click. The case opened. Inside, no weapons, no classified battle plans, no nuclear codes, just paper, dozens of files, neatly stacked, stamped confidential, and photographs, grainy but clear enough to recognize faces. Ethan froze, because he knew two of those faces. Not generals, not politicians, CEOs, powerful men at the helm of corporations worth billions, companies that had been quietly winning defense contracts, funding research, and shaping policy from the shadows. The files weren't just evidence. They were proof that America's wars weren't being steered from the Pentagon at all. They were being steered from boardrooms. Ethan's voice trembled. This is bigger than the military. This is bigger than government." Monroe closed the case with a slam. Her face was calm, but her chest was tight, because she understood the stakes. If the public ever saw these files, everything would change. Contracts canceled, careers destroyed, power stripped from the hands that had controlled it for decades. But that's why she was being hunted. The SUVs outside weren't chasing her because she talked back. They weren't chasing her because she was a black woman who dared to stand her ground. They were chasing her because she had been carrying the receipts of a system nobody was ever supposed to expose. And here's the question you need to wrestle with. If you had the case in your hands, what would you do? Expose it, no matter the cost? Or protect it, knowing the wrong leak could bring chaos to millions? The case was heavier now, not in weight, but in consequence. Every step Monroe took with it, every glance Ethan cast toward it, carried the shadow of what they'd just seen. The files inside weren't just secrets. They were leverage, and leverage is worth more than gold. For hours they moved in silence, through alleys, safe houses, whispers in the dead of night. Each moment, Monroe searched for someone she could trust. Each moment, Ethan scribbled notes furiously, his mind racing with headlines. At first, she thought he was simply a journalist hungry for the truth. But then, little things began to stand out. The phone he carried, a model she'd only ever seen in intelligence briefings. The way he always seemed to know the roads to take, the shortcuts to avoid checkpoints. And then, one detail she couldn't shake. When she'd first met Ethan in the lot, before headlights cut across the asphalt, he hadn't looked surprised to see her, almost as if he had expected her. The thought festered in her mind until it became impossible to ignore. And that night, in the safety of a shuttered motel on the edge of Arlington, she made her move. While Ethan slept, Monroe reached for his bag. Inside, documents. Not the scattered notes of a journalist, but structured files. Names, dates, coded entries, all marked with clearance stamps she knew well. He wasn't just chasing the story, he was part of it. Her chest tightened. The anonymous call that had lured him into the chase. The way he'd found her coordinates. The persistence with which he'd demanded to see the case. It all made sense now. Ethan Cole wasn't the rescuer, he was the handler. Sent not to free her, but to guide her exactly where they wanted her to go. At dawn, Ethan stirred awake to find Monroe standing over him, the case clutched tight in her grip, her eyes cold. "You're not who you say you are," she whispered. "Are you?" And here's where the story fractures. Was Ethan really working for the very people hunting her? Or was Monroe's paranoia the first sign that the weight of betrayal was breaking her down? The truth, like the files, was still sealed. But one fact remained. Only one of them would leave that motel with the case. And I want to hear from you. Was Ethan ever on her side? Or was this betrayal inevitable from the start? Comment below. And don't just watch this story, subscribe now. Because the next chapter tears open the final conflict, and it ends on a cliffhanger you'll never forget. The motel room was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's counting down. General Monroe stood near the window, the case locked in her grip. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his hands raised halfway, palms open, not surrender, not trust, but something in between. Neither spoke for a long moment, because words, at this point, could be weapons too. Finally, Monroe broke the silence. "You've been leading me, every step, every turn." Ethan's voice was low, steady. "You think they'd let you run around with that case without someone close by? You were never alone. You were never supposed to be." Her stomach knotted. Confirmation. But then, his tone shifted. "I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting you. If you knew what was inside, if you knew how dangerous it was." He trailed off, staring at the floor. Then his eyes lifted. "I'm not here to destroy you, Monroe. I'm here to make sure you survive." Her grip tightened. Was that a confession or another manipulation? The sound of engines rumbled outside, SUVs pulling into the lot. They had found them. Ethan stood, his voice sharper now. "We don't have time. You can hand me the case, and I can get you out of here alive. Or you can hold on to it, and neither of us walks out." Monroe's heart pounded. Every instinct in her screamed not to trust him. But outside, boots were already hitting the pavement. Shadows moved across the curtains. For a split second, the two locked eyes. And then, the glass shattered. Gunfire ripped into the room. Bullets tore through the walls, the bed frame splintering, plaster exploding into dust. Monroe hit the floor, dragging the case under her chest. Ethan dove beside her, covering her with his shoulder, pulling her toward the bathroom. Was he saving her life, or keeping the case in play? The line blurred with every shot, and in the chaos, one truth echoed louder than the gunfire itself. Whoever controlled that case controlled the outcome. The air reeked of gunpowder and drywall dust. Every second, another round tore through the motel walls, spraying sparks across the carpet. General Monroe pressed the case tight against her chest as splinters rained down. Her ears rang with the echo of shouts outside, commands, boots pounding, men moving in formation. This wasn't a police raid. This was an extraction. Ethan grabbed her arm, dragging her low across the floor. "Bathroom! Now!" he shouted over the chaos. They crawled, glass crunching under their knees. Bullets punched into the doorframe as they slammed it shut, locking it. For a moment, silence. Then, an explosion. A flashbang detonated in the next room, rattling the walls, shaking the ceiling tiles loose. Monroe steadied her breath. She had been in combat zones. She had led units through firefights. But this was different. Because this time, the enemy wasn't across the sea. They were right here, outside her door. Ethan pulled a pistol from his waistband. It wasn't regulation military issue. It wasn't standard police. It was private contractor gear. Monroe's eyes narrowed. "Who are you really working for?" she demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he pushed open the bathroom window, pointing to the alley below. "If we argue now, we're both dead. Move." She hesitated only a second before climbing out. Her boots hit the asphalt just as headlights flared at the end of the alley. More SUVs. The trap was tightening. They sprinted into the shadows, weaving between dumpsters and broken fences, the case clutched so tightly, Monroe's knuckles turned white. Gunfire chased them, bullets sparking against the metal siding, echoing down the narrow space. Finally, a fence, too high for most to scale in the dark. But Monroe leapt first, landing hard on the other side. Ethan followed, slower, nearly dropping the pistol as he caught himself. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not police, but a mimic, a distraction. These men wanted no witnesses. As they vanished into the night, one thought clawed its way through Monroe's mind. They weren't supposed to survive this. This wasn't a chase. It was a cleanup. And yet, the case was still in her hands. The war over its contents hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Now I want you to weigh in. If you were Monroe, would you keep trusting Ethan, even for survival? Or cut him loose before his secrets pulled you under? The city lights flickered in the distance as Monroe and Ethan moved through the industrial district, breathing hard, every muscle burning from the escape. For the first time since the chase began, they had a moment to stop, a moment to think. They found cover inside an abandoned rail depot, broken glass across the floor, rusted tracks vanishing into darkness. The case rested between them, like a loaded weapon nobody dared touch. Monroe finally spoke. "You knew what was in here all along." Ethan's silence was an answer in itself. His face, harder now, stripped of the easy charm he had worn before, looked less like a journalist and more like a man who had been following orders his entire life. Finally, he nodded. "I didn't tell you because if you knew, you would have destroyed it, and they'd never let you live for that." "They?" Monroe's voice cut like steel. "Who are they?" Ethan took a breath. Then he said the names. Not generals, not Pentagon officials, executives. CEOs of 3 of the most powerful defense contractors in the country, companies Monroe had signed contracts with herself. The files inside the case weren't about enemies abroad. They were about profits made at home. Billions funneled into wars that were never meant to end. Conflicts engineered not for victory, but for dividends. Monroe felt her stomach twist. Her entire career, every order she'd ever given, every soldier she'd ever buried, it was all tangled in their game. Her voice trembled with fury. "You're telling me everything we fought for, every life lost, was just a business model?" Ethan didn't look at her. "War has always been business, but this proves it. These files don't just name them, they map out every deal, every cover-up, every official they bought. It's not just corruption, it's control." The weight of the truth pressed down on Monroe like a vice. This wasn't just injustice, it was betrayal, on a scale too large to comprehend. But before she could speak, her burner phone buzzed. The number on the screen froze her blood. It wasn't from Ethan's contacts. It wasn't from the Pentagon. It was from the one man she never expected to hear from again, the Secretary of Defense. And his message was only 3 words. "We need to talk." The phone buzzed again in Monroe's hand. 3 words glowing on the cracked screen. "We need to talk." For a moment she didn't breathe. The Secretary of Defense wasn't a man who asked. He commanded, and yet here he was, reaching directly to her. Ethan's eyes flicked to the screen. His expression darkened. "Don't answer. That's not a lifeline. That's a leash." But Monroe's instincts told her otherwise. If the secretary knew where she was, then the hunt wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about her. Her thumb hovered over the button. One press, and she'd be pulled into a conversation that could save her or bury her forever. Finally, she answered. A voice filled the silence, calm, steady, heavy with power. "General Monroe, you've made things complicated." Monroe's jaw clenched. "You know what's in this case." A pause, and then, almost a chuckle. "I wrote what's in that case." Ethan froze, his entire face drained of color. The secretary's voice continued, steady as stone. "You're carrying proof of a machine that keeps this country alive. Yes, corporations profit. Yes, wars extend longer than they should. But ask yourself, General, what happens if the world learns the truth? Markets collapse, alliances fracture, soldiers stop fighting, and enemies move in. Is that the future you want on your conscience?" Monroe's pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't a denial. It was an admission. A confession spoken with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. Ethan whispered sharply, "End the call. Now." But Monroe didn't move, because the secretary's next words froze her in place. "There are 2 roads ahead. Hand the case to me, and I will erase your charges, restore your command, and make you untouchable. Or, keep running. And watch your name, Your Honor, your very life, destroyed in ways you can't imagine." Her hand trembled, not out of fear, but out of rage, because she realized the choice wasn't just hers anymore. It was everyone's. The soldiers who fought, the families who grieved, the citizens who never knew. And just as she opened her mouth to respond, the line went dead, not disconnected. Cut. Someone else had silenced the call. Monroe and Ethan stared at each other in the darkness of the rail depot. If the secretary hadn't ended the call, then who had? Outside, headlights swept across the broken windows. Engines revved, another convoy pulling in. And this time, Monroe knew they weren't here to arrest. They were here to erase. Engines roared outside the depot, low and synchronized, like a predator's growl. Floodlights snapped on, cutting through the shattered glass, slicing the shadows where Monroe and Ethan crouched. This wasn't a raid. It was an execution. Monroe gripped the case, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She had been hunted before. She had stood on battlefields. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the mission wasn't to capture her. It was to wipe her from existence and erase every trace of the files she carried. Ethan peered through a crack in the wall. They're contractors, not military, not police. They're here to finish it. Boots hit the ground. Dozens. Moving in formation, rifles raised, silencers fitted. Professional, efficient, deadly. Monroe's mind raced. She could fight and die in the crossfire, or she could run and lose the case to the very hands she'd sworn to protect it from. The sound of a loudspeaker crackled, cutting through the night air. A voice barked, cold and mechanical. "General Monroe, Ethan Cole, step out. You will not be harmed." The lie was almost insulting. Ethan cursed under his breath. "They don't want prisoners. They want bodies." Monroe's gaze hardened. She pulled the pistol from Ethan's waistband, checking the magazine, chambering around. Her voice was steady, defiant. "They'll get neither." The depot doors rattled as charges were set. A countdown whispered in the dark. 3, 2, 1. The explosion ripped the steel wide open. Floodlights blinded the room as black-clad figures surged in, weapons raised. And in that instant, before the first bullet flew, Monroe's phone buzzed again. A single notification. A message from an unknown sender. Don't trust him. Her eyes darted to Ethan. The man standing at her side, the only one she had left to rely on. Was the message warning her about him, or was it sent by him? Gunfire erupted, cutting the moment short. The depot became chaos, steel groaning, glass shattering, the night alive with fire. And in the middle of it all, Monroe clutched the case tighter. Because she knew the truth now. This wasn't a fight for her survival. This was a fight to decide whether the truth itself survived. Gunfire tore the depot apart. Every shot echoed like thunder inside the steel shell, sparks raining down as rounds carved into the walls. Monroe dove behind a rusted support beam, clutching the case tight. The blast of automatic rifles was deafening, each burst closer than the last. Shards of glass and twisted metal scattered across the concrete floor. Ethan dropped beside her, pistol raised, returning fire in short, disciplined bursts. 3 silhouettes fell in the doorway, yet more shadows replaced them instantly, moving with ruthless precision. "Back exit!" Ethan shouted. But Monroe hesitated, because the message still burned on her phone. Don't trust him. Her eyes flicked to Ethan. The way he moved, the way he aimed. Not at killing blows, but at suppressing, buying just enough time. As if his goal wasn't to win the fight, but to make sure the case didn't leave the building. The thought hit her like a bullet. Was Ethan firing at the enemy, or just making sure she stayed cornered? Bullets ripped past, snapping her out of the thought. One grazed her arm, tearing fabric, drawing blood. The sting of it sharpened her focus. She had seconds to decide. Trust him, or cut him loose. Ethan pulled her toward the loading bay. "We move now," he barked, but his grip was iron, too tight, like he was pulling her, not protecting her. The shadows closed in, boots pounding, muzzle flashes lighting the night. For a breathless instant, Monroe imagined turning the pistol on Ethan himself, ending the doubt with a single shot. But before she could act, a grenade clattered across the floor, rolling to a stop between them. The explosion ripped the world in half. The shockwave hurled Monroe across the concrete, her body slamming against the steel tracks. Her ears rang, her vision blurred. Through the haze, she saw the case, sliding across the floor, away from her, and Ethan, scrambling after it, not toward her, not toward the exit, toward the case. Her chest heaved, fury and betrayal crashing together with the ringing in her skull. Because now, there was no doubt. Ethan wasn't fighting for her survival. He was fighting for control. And in that instant, Monroe realized the greatest danger in this room wasn't the men with rifles. It was the man at her side. Smoke curled across the depot floor, thick and choking. Sparks rained from broken lights, casting jagged shadows across the wreckage. Monroe staggered to her feet, blood dripping down her arm, her breath ragged. Across the room, Ethan crouched low, his hand clutching the case, their eyes locked through the haze. No words were needed. The truth was laid bare. He hadn't come to save her. He had come for the case. Contractors stormed the building, rifles raised, sweeping the corners with ruthless precision. But Monroe barely saw them. Her focus tunneled to one point, Ethan's hand wrapped around that case handle. "Give it to me," she growled, pistol leveled on him. Ethan's voice was steady, almost calm. "If you take this, you won't live long enough to open it. You know that. Let me carry it. I can navigate them. I can buy us time." "Time for who?" Monroe snapped. "For me, or for them?" Ethan's jaw clenched. The silence between them was louder than the gunfire echoing in the rafters. And then, he bolted. Monroe lunged forward, firing a round that shattered the steel beside him. He ducked, weaving through the shadows, dragging the case with him. Contractors pivoted instantly, mistaking him for the target. Bullets lit the air as Monroe charged after him, weaving through chaos, every nerve alive with fury. They collided at the far end of the depot, bodies slamming into rusted rail cars. The case skidded across the floor, spinning between them. For a heartbeat, they both froze, both staring at it, both reaching. The contractors closed in, boots pounding, shouts rising. And still, Monroe and Ethan grappled. Fists, elbows, desperation in every strike. This wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival. Finally, Monroe landed a blow that sent Ethan sprawling against the tracks. She grabbed the case, clutching it to her chest. But when she looked up, a dozen rifles were pointed at her, contractors encircling, their sights fixed squarely on the case in her hands. And Ethan, bleeding, panting, lifted his head from the floor. A twisted smile ghosted across his face, because whether she lived or died, he knew one truth. The case had never been hers to keep. The depot was a cage of steel and shadows. Dozens of rifles glared through the smoke, laser sights dotting Monroe's chest. One wrong move, and her body would join the wreckage already littering the floor. She tightened her grip on the case, blood dripping from her arm, her breath steadying into something almost defiant. Because if this was the end, she wouldn't go quietly. A voice barked through the silence. "Drop the case." The command echoed, sharp, unyielding. The men didn't advance. They didn't need to. Every angle was covered. Ethan staggered to his knees, his face smeared with blood, his eyes locked on Monroe. His voice cracked, somewhere between warning and plea. "Don't do this. You're outgunned. You're outplayed. Hand it over, and maybe you walk out alive." But Monroe's mind wasn't on survival anymore. It was on the soldiers she had buried, on the families who never got answers, on the truth she now held in her hands, a truth written in files and photos that had cost countless lives. She raised her voice, steady and unshaken. "You can kill me. But if you do, you'll never stop what's in here. You'll never stop the truth." The contractors didn't flinch. They weren't men driven by fear or conscience. They were driven by orders, and orders didn't bend. One stepped forward, weapon leveled. "Last chance, General." Monroe's heart pounded. She weighed the impossible choice. Drop the case, and live as a pawn. Keep it, and die a martyr. Her finger brushed the trigger of her pistol, still warm from the last exchange. One bullet left. Not nearly enough to change the outcome, but maybe enough to change the story. For a moment, time slowed. Her eyes met Ethan's, and in that fleeting second, she saw it, the flicker of something behind his gaze. Not fear, not anger, regret. Was it real, or another mask? The silence broke with a single sound, the click of Monroe's safety being released, and then a deafening crash overhead. The depot's roof buckled, metal tearing, sparks raining down as floodlights outside flickered and died. The entire building plunged into chaos, shouts rising, weapons swinging in confusion. Someone else had just entered the fight, and for the first time all night, Monroe realized she wasn't just running from enemies, she was caught between them. The depot trembled like a dying beast, girders groaning as dust filled the air. Contractors scrambled, weapons whipping upward, eyes darting to the collapsing roof. Through the haze, figures dropped down on ropes, black-clad, silent, moving with precision far beyond mercenaries. Monroe ducked behind a railcar, clutching the case tight. Her instinct screamed. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else. The newcomers hit the ground, rifles sweeping with brutal efficiency. They weren't aiming for Monroe, not yet. They were aiming for the contractors. Gunfire exploded, deafening and merciless. Contractors fell in waves, cut down before they could regroup. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood as chaos swallowed the depot whole. Ethan crawled toward Monroe, his voice hoarse, desperate. "You don't get it. They're not here for me. They're not here for you. They're here for what's in that case." Monroe's pulse thundered. "Who are they?" Ethan shook his head, eyes wide with something close to terror. "They're the ones who don't wear names, who don't exist on paper. You think the secretary scares me? He answers to them." The words hit like a blade twisting in her gut. If he was telling the truth, then every enemy she'd faced so far was only a shadow of the real power. The black-clad soldiers moved in formation, cutting down the last of the contractors with surgical precision. And then, silence. One of them stepped forward, helmet reflecting the flicker of firelight, voice metallic through a modulator. "General Monroe, hand over the case, now." Monroe's hands tightened on the steel handle. Her voice dropped, steady but burning with defiance. "And if I don't?" The soldier tilted his head. For a heartbeat, no answer came. And then, through the modulator, a voice she recognized. A voice she hadn't heard in years. Her chest seized. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. The soldier lifted their visor, and Monroe's world stopped. The visor lifted, and the world tilted. Monroe's breath caught, her grip on the case faltering for the first time all night. The face staring back at her was one she had buried long ago. A man the Pentagon had declared dead in action. A man she had mourned with folded flags and whispered promises at a graveside. Colonel Ryan Mercer, her former second-in-command, her brother in arms. The man who had once sworn he'd follow her into hell. Yet here he was, alive, armored, and standing at the head of the very force demanding she surrender. The depot felt smaller, the air heavier. Every memory of laughter in the field, every battle fought side by side, every sacrifice. They crashed against the sight of him now, weapon leveled, eyes burning with something unreadable. "Ryan." Her voice broke, low and disbelieving. "They told me you were gone." Mercer's jaw tightened. "They told me you were loyal." The words hit harder than any bullet. Loyal. To what? To who? Monroe's mind reeled. Had he been watching her all these years? Had every battle she fought been part of some larger game she never even saw? Behind him, his black-clad soldiers fanned out, efficient, merciless. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take. Ethan staggered closer, face pale, voice trembling. "You see now? You were never fighting for justice. You were fighting for ghosts." Mercer's gaze flicked to Ethan, then back to Monroe. "Hand me the case. Don't make me treat you like the enemy." The depot's silence was suffocating. Her hands shook, not from fear but from fury. Because if Mercer was alive, then every report, every briefing, every funeral had been a lie. Her eyes locked on his. "Then answer me one thing. Why?" Mercer's lips pressed into a thin line. And then, just enough for her to hear, "Because we were never on the same side." The words carved through her, colder than the steel in her hands. And in that instant, Monroe knew. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about betrayal, buried deep in the very roots of command. The depot burned in the background, sparks hissing, steel groaning, bodies scattered like broken chess pieces. But inside the circle of gunmen, the world had narrowed to just two figures. General Monroe, Colonel Ryan Mercer, once comrades, now something else entirely. Monroe's knuckles whitened on the case handle. Mercer's soldiers stood ready, rifles steady, waiting for his command. But he didn't give it. Not yet. "Talk," Monroe demanded, her voice raw but unyielding. "Tell me how you're standing here. Tell me how the man I buried is now leading a ghost army." Mercer's expression didn't shift. No remorse, no warmth, only calculation. "They buried me because it was easier than admitting the truth," he said evenly. "Easier to feed the public a hero's story than explain what really happened overseas. I didn't die in that desert, Monroe. I was taken." Her stomach twisted. Taken. The word carried weight. Shadows behind it. Mercer stepped closer, visor now clipped at his side, his eyes locked onto hers. "There are levels above what you've seen. Operations that don't exist in files. Chains of command that don't answer to presidents or even secretaries. I wasn't abandoned. I was recruited." Monroe's chest tightened. Recruited, not saved, not rescued, pulled into the very darkness she had spent her life fighting. "You sold out," she spat, fury cracking her voice. "You let them use you, use your name, use your silence." Mercer's jaw clenched. You think you've been fighting for justice? For honor? No, Monroe. You've been fighting to protect their lives. Every mission, every order, every loss, you were just cleaning up their mess. The words cut deeper than bullets, because part of her had always wondered why the missions never added up, why the names on the casualty lists never matched the silence in the reports. Mercer leaned in, his voice dropping to a blade's whisper. And the case you're clutching? It's not evidence of corruption. It's proof of design, plans, systems, the next phase of control. You think you can expose it? You think the world will even believe it? They won't. They'll bury you the way they buried me. The room pulsed with silence. Every soldier's rifle hummed in the air, but no one fired, because this wasn't just about orders anymore. It was about truth, two versions of it colliding like tectonic plates. Monroe's voice cracked through the tension. Then why not kill me now? Why drag me into this theater if the game is already over? Mercer's stare held hers, and for the first time, his voice faltered, just slightly. Because you were the only one who ever fought for something real. And maybe, part of me still wants you to choose our side before they erase you completely. The depot seemed to tilt under the weight of his words. Mercer wasn't just a ghost. He was an invitation. And Monroe, bloodied, cornered, clutching the case, was standing on the fault line between exposing everything and joining the very machine she had sworn to destroy. The fire crackled behind them, the depot's skeleton glowing red against the night. Every soldier in Mercer's unit kept their rifles fixed, but no one fired. The battlefield had gone quiet, not because the fight was over, but because the next move would decide everything. Mercer broke the silence. His voice was steady, cold, but laced with something almost human. You're standing on a line, Monroe. Cross it and you're gone. Stay on it, and you disappear anyway. But if you step over to my side, he paused, his eyes locking on hers, you live. You learn how the world really works, and maybe, just maybe, you change it from inside. Monroe's chest rose and fell, each breath heavy with rage and disbelief. They tried to erase you, and you let them succeed. You think wearing their armor makes you powerful? No. It makes you owned. Mercer's jaw tightened. I thought the same thing once, until I realized power isn't about freedom. It's about leverage, and that case you're clutching, that's leverage they can't afford to lose. Give it to me, and I guarantee your name never makes the kill list. The words hung in the air like a noose. Ethan coughed, dragging himself upright against a steel beam, his voice cutting through the standoff. Don't believe him. Once you hand it over, you're finished. They'll use you until you're empty, then toss you in a hole. That's what they do. Mercer's eyes flicked toward Ethan, narrowing. You're still alive because you're useful. Don't mistake that for trust. Then, back to Monroe, his voice hardening. You want to keep fighting shadows until they bury you in one? Fine. But know this. The moment you say no, you're not just rejecting me. You're rejecting survival. The case felt heavier in Monroe's hands, like it carried the weight of every soldier who'd ever fallen under her command. Her pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't just an offer, it was a verdict. She could feel her trigger finger twitching, the last bullet still waiting in the chamber. One choice, one squeeze, one act of defiance, and everything would ignite. But if she lowered the weapon, if she gave in, if she crossed the line Mercer drew, she would live. And living meant carrying the weight of what she'd become. Her voice cracked the silence, low and fierce. Your side doesn't scare me, Ryan. What scares me is becoming you. Mercer's expression didn't shift, but for the first time, his eyes flickered, just faintly, with something like sorrow. And then, he lifted his hand. Every rifle clicked in unison, aimed squarely at her chest. The rifles glared red in the firelight, a wall of steel and silence closing around her. Mercer's hand stayed raised, calm, steady, absolute. One word from him, and it would all be over. Monroe tightened her grip on the pistol. One bullet left. One choice. Her mind raced. Through every mission, every betrayal, every soldier who had died without answers. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about refusing to surrender to the very machine that had swallowed them all. Her finger brushed the trigger, and then she moved. A single shot cracked the air, sharp and final. For a split second, no one breathed. No one spoke. The round tore through the dark. But whether it struck Mercer, his soldiers, or the fuel line sparking just feet away, the smoke swallowed the truth. The depot erupted. Flames roared, steel shrieked, bodies scrambled in the chaos. Shouts echoed through the inferno, orders clashing with panic. And in the storm of fire and shadows, Monroe vanished, the case still clutched in her hands. When the smoke thinned, Mercer stood unmoving, his soldiers regrouping around him. His visor lowered once more, hiding the flicker of emotion that had crossed his face. He didn't order pursuit. He didn't need to, because Monroe hadn't escaped. Not really. She had only stepped deeper into the war he had promised her. And somewhere in the night, with the case pressed to her chest and the echo of that single bullet ringing in her ears, General Monroe knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning.